Good evening, Upper Midwest. Jim Shaw, your guest host today on Down the Road with Joel. I am a longtime broadcast journalist in North Dakota and Minnesota, currently a columnist for Forum Communications. I want to tell you about the show today. Second half of the show, we're going to talk about a West Fargo woman, a real social activist, has written a great book. Her name is Vicki Schmidt. But our first guest, someone, if you have read North Dakota newspapers over the year, I'm sure you're familiar with his name. His name is Jack Zaleski, longtime North Dakota journalist, and there's so much to talk to him about, especially current events. So, Jack, welcome. Nice to have you here.
Jim, it's always good to be with you.
Thank you. Well, the big topic in the world is the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think Putin did this?
Well, Putin has made no secret since he became the leader of Russia, even before, I guess, when you look into his history, he's made no secret that he thought the greatest tragedy in the history of Russia was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he has dedicated his life, I believe, and now it's showing up in big ways, to restoring some form of the Soviet Empire. He's done it in several places already with success, and now Ukraine, which is a huge chunk that he's bitten off. And if successful, he will have made another big step into realizing his ambition, his dream, to bring the old Soviet Union back.
Oh, I meant to do this before I went into Ukraine. Can you give the viewers a little background of your journalistic history?
Oh, sure. I retired in 2017, fully retired in 2017 after 30 years as editorial page editor of the Forum of Fargo-Moorhead. Before that, I was the editor and general manager of the Devil's Lake Daily Journal. I came to North Dakota in the late 1960s after having been born, raised, and educated in Connecticut, the University of Connecticut, and came out here, married a Western North Dakota girl whose family ranches near the Badlands, and stayed. And that was more than 50 years ago, and it was the right thing to do. So,
well, I know the feeling of coming out here and
yes,
marrying a North Dakota woman and
yes,
staying. I've got over 40 years in my belt for that, so we have that in common. Both, especially since we both grew up in New England.
My friends in New England sometimes think I'm a slow learner.
I hear that. I know.
Yeah.
I know. I have to try to educate my friends in New England about what it's like here. And
That's
we have indoor plumbing, and yes, we have running water and all that stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get back to the war in Ukraine.
Sure.
How do you think it's going from the standpoint of the Russians? They're advancing, but not as quickly as people thought. The world does not seem to be with them, but what's your take on that?
Well, I think that's exactly right. Most of the analysis I've seen and the reporting, the excellent on-the-ground reporting from American and European news sources, indicate that the Russians underestimated the resolve and the military of the Ukrainians. And so while it seems to be inevitable, given the size of the Russian army and their willingness to commit atrocities as they move into the Ukraine, it is very likely they will take over the country. But I think they miscalculated the resolve of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian army, and the resolve of the Western Alliance, Europe and the United States, and others. Now, whether that resolve by the West turns into some sort of an action to prevent the Russians from occupying Ukraine, that's another story altogether. And I think that has to do with the dynamics of NATO, NATO's reluctance to get into a wider war, the United States' reluctance to get into a wider war by directly challenging the Russians. So right now, what we do know is that Putin and his folks miscalculated the resolve of both the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian nation, and the Western Alliance, which wasn't much of an alliance over the last 5 years or so until President Biden, whose deep and vast foreign policy experience was brought to bear here to bring that alliance together in a way that hasn't been true for a long, long time.
I am so impressed, and I admire so much the courage and the bravery and the patriotism of the Ukrainian people and their president, who is target number one. And I'm sure the Russians would love to capture and kill President Zelensky. He had the chance to leave. He said, no, I'm staying with my people. But again, what's your take on the patriotism and pride of the Ukrainian people and the job that President Zelensky is doing?
Well, you know, Russia tried to make the case that there is no such thing as the Ukrainian people, and that the Ukraine is really not a country. It's always been a province of Russia of some sort. That's not true when you really look at the history as it's honestly portrayed, not the way the Russians are portraying it. Zelensky, with two Y's, which is an interesting spelling for Zelensky.
And I've seen it both ways. I never know which way is the right way.
I think the Ukrainian way is the two ways.
Okay.
The two Y's.
But
Y's. Anyway,
okay.
So here's this guy who was an entertainer, not very, not thought of as a person with much depth or experience. And before the war, his approval ratings were pretty low. His approval ratings now are, north of 92%, I think, among his people, which is startling, but not unjustified given the leader he has turned out to be. He has grown into the role, and he has become a hero, not only to his own people, but I think a hero of freedom-loving peoples across the globe. And so the Russians, I'm sure, want his voice silenced. Their pattern has been to kidnap mayors. We've seen, at least two now, maybe more. They kidnap the mayors and take over the city halls and city governments, therefore pretty much decapitating the local governments of some significant cities, big cities. That's the way they would like to do it for the national government, decapitate the Ukrainian national government, and that means getting Zelensky. So he's at risk. There's no question he and his family are at risk, and he has made it clear. Unlike some leaders who get into these kinds of situations, he is not going into exile to set up a government in exile or that sort of thing. He's staying in his country for now. His safety, I think, is pretty important. Without him, it might be very difficult to rally the Ukrainian people as they have been rallied. So you have to be impressed by him, very impressed.
I'm extremely impressed. I want to ask you about a controversy. It appeared that NATO, in the form of the U.S. and Poland taking the lead, they were going to supply the Ukrainians with some fighter jets, and then the United States nixed that. And personally, as long as the United States is not getting involved directly in the fighting, I would love to see those planes delivered to Ukraine. Do you have thoughts on whether that would be a logical move or not?
Well, you and I have talked about this, and we disagree on the basic nuts and bolts of it. And I find myself agreeing with the administration's logic on this and with the NATO logic on this. Don't forget, Poland just didn't say, come and get the jets and fly them around and into Ukrainian airspace. Poland had a caveat attached to this agreement, and the caveat was the jets would be based at an American base in Germany. Therefore, any combat missions would be coming from an American base in a NATO country, flying into Ukrainian airspace and confronting the Russian Air Force. Therefore, according to the administration, widening the war because you're getting into a direct confrontation with Russia because you're flying out of an American base in Germany. So there is a logic if you don't want to expand the war. There is a logic to that if you don't want to expand the war to the point where the Russians have the excuse of going in and maybe attacking that American base. Where those jets would be based. So
I just want to ask you, how is that different than supplying the Ukrainians, as we have, with anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles? Those weapons came from NATO countries, so it's just a different form of the Ukrainians trying to defend themselves, namely planes versus missiles. I don't understand the distinction.
Well, it's qualitatively different because you'd be flying these Polish jets out of an American Air Force base, an American base in Germany. So it's qualitatively different than shipping weapons without personnel, without pilots, in cockpits across the border into the Ukraine for the Ukrainians to use. Not unlike what we did in World War II when Churchill was begging for help during the Blitz of London, and Franklin Roosevelt shipped over whatever he could to support the British, but did not go to war with Germany at that time. It's not an exact parallel, but it's a similar it's a similar structure. So I think the time might come when NATO gets involved, and when I say NATO gets involved, that means the United States gets more involved. You get frustrated watching this develop because there seems to be not much the West can do, but there is. The sanctions, of course, are going to be incredibly harsh on Russia. I mean, the damage to the Russian economy is going to last for a long time. But whether Putin cares about that, in light of his larger ambitions, is the question. Most of the world is against him, but whether or not the world, including the Western civilized nations, are willing to put troops on the ground or planes in the air to stop him from occupying the Ukraine, I don't have an answer to that. But right now, this seems a reluctance to do that.
Many Republicans, including North Dakota Senator Kevin Cramer, Minnesota Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach, are blaming the Russian invasion on Joe Biden, saying if it wasn't for Biden's weakness, Putin wouldn't have done this. What's your reaction to them blaming Biden for the invasion?
Well, that's outrageously wrong, and they know it's wrong. And if they don't know it's wrong, they're stupid. I say that without hesitation. Kramer knows better than that. I've known Kevin for a long time. He knows better than that. He's playing the political card. The fact of the matter is that it was the president he admired so much who stopped sales of arms to the Ukraine when they were beginning to build up because they knew what might have been happening. And President Trump at the time, stopped those sales to the Ukraine, stopped that help.
Secretly, I might add.
Secretly, for political reasons. He was playing his political game, trying to get some sort of advantage over the Biden camp, the Democrats at that point. So the real story about this is that Trump is probably more responsible for handicapping the Ukrainian army than anything Biden has done. If anything, Biden has hardened the alliance and sent billions and billions of dollars worth of arms and equipment made by U.S. defense contractors into the Ukraine, whereas President Trump was pulling that stuff back and stopping any more from going in, therefore handicapping the Ukrainians for what they're facing now. So Representative Fischbach and Senator Kramer, they're playing the political card at a time when they really shouldn't. This is something that most polls show unite most Americans about sympathy for the Ukraine and wanting to help Ukraine, and yet people like the senator and the congresswoman want to play the political card. That's disappointing, but not surprising.
The big race right now, and it kind of came out of nowhere, is Rick Becker, state legislator, taking on John Hoeven, incumbent Republican, for the race for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that?
Well, it's kind of a made-up race. I know you and I have talked about this, and we have some disagreements about what the Becker candidacy means for Hoeven. I don't think it means a lot. I think when push comes to shove, even if Becker gets the nomination, gets the nod from the convention, and they go head-to-head in a primary, I think John Hoeven, given his history at the ballot box and the ratings we see, his approval ratings, and how much he's admired as a U.S. senator in North Dakota, that he'll blow Becker out of the water. But I don't think Becker's purpose is to win. Becker's purpose is to energize a group of people within the North Dakota Republican Party who are making moves, not only in this high-profile run for the Senate, but are looking at school board races, are looking at county and city commission races, are looking at park board races, things of that nature, getting into local forms of government, local units of government, to promote their brand of destructive governance. And I think that's part of what Becker's doing here. The upside, I think, for people who don't appreciate Mr. Becker's approach to governing is that there is an obvious and growing division in the North Dakota Republican Party, which of course dominates the state, dominates the legislature, dominates most elected offices, all elected offices on the state level. And so the traditional Republican Party, the people who really do the work in the state and state government, are seeing a division that's getting wider and more nasty as the months go on. Becker is a leader of promoting that division and fomenting that nastiness. And so I think that most North Dakotans will reject that. Not all, because there are enough that go to the meetings, that go to the district meetings, which are being held now. And you see some of that happening now where Becker-like forces are taking over the district meetings in various counties throughout the state and electing slates of delegates to the Republican convention who think the way Mr. Becker does. And that is anathema to the party because it deepens the divisions.
I think, and I want to get your opinion on this, I think this is going to be a very close race, because I think Rick Becker is appealing to the Trump base. He's running to the right of Hoeven. Becker has come out and said that he would not have certified the presidential election, which Hoeven did, even though we both agree that there was no reason not to certify that election. He's criticized Hoeven for voting for the infrastructure bill, which again we both agree is needed. But Donald Trump is very popular in this state. And again, when you're running for the nomination, not a general election, but a nomination, I think Rick Becker can connect. What's your opinion? Well,
again, if he stacks the convention, if he goes around to all the districts and stacks the district meetings with his people and they win, then of course the convention could very well give him the nomination over Hoeven. I would not bet the farm on that one yet, because Hoeven is, when he decides to be, he's a formidable candidate. He has a lot of money to spend if he chooses to. So I wouldn't bet the farm on that, but I think that's the strategy that the Becker and his forces are using. But you know, when push comes to shove, and you look at what Representative Becker stands for by his own words, he is against pretty much everything that North Dakota is, was, has become, and looks to become. He was on the Joel Heitkamp show last week, and I listened to what he had to say. And his philosophy of governing, his philosophy of what government and the private sector can do together, is so at odds with North Dakota's history from the beginning. He talks about corporate welfare, where corporate welfare is nothing new in North Dakota. It began with the Homestead Act and the railroads, for God's sakes. It goes all the way back to the prehistory of the state. And then you look at what's going on now with things like, let's take an example where there's been such great success of a public and private partnership, the Renaissance Zone. The Renaissance Zone legislation, which was passed by conservative Republicans in the North Dakota legislature, 30 years ago now. John Dorso, Representative John Dorso from Fargo, was one of the champions of that legislation, which has proved to be everything it was promised to be and more when you look at cities like Fargo and Bismarck and others that have taken advantage of it. So Becker would be against that kind of thing. Becker would be against the partnership that has come together, the financial, the unique and workable financial support that has come together for the Fargo-Moorhead diversion project. Becker would be against that because he would see it as corporate welfare. For what? People that drive bulldozers.
Right.
I don't get it. So he's against most everything that is that is woven into the tapestry of the culture of North Dakota, and I just don't see if he's really exposed for who he is or what he believes, that people would vote for him.
What if Donald Trump endorses him, which I'm guessing is a legitimate possibility? Does that change the race?
No. I think he's already identified with the less thoughtful members of the Trump camp.
Speaking of Trump, let's go there. Donald Trump has hinted that he's going to run again in 2024. Do you think Donald Trump will run in 2024? And if he does run, does he get the Republican nomination?
Well, right now, if Republicans are polled, he is their number one man still. But and I think there are a few who are, not close, but within striking distance of him in those polls. But you have to take that with a grain of salt too, because who else is there?
Ted Cruz, Mike Pence,
yes, I know,
Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo,
but who commands the kind of attention?
DeSantis,
and also not only that, has the power and the will to go after people who are not for him, who would say they're for DeSantis or they're for Mark Rubio or somebody. And so, Trump is not just threatens, he does actually put his resources behind candidates who would knock off people who don't see things his way. And by that I mean Republicans who don't see things his way. That's been happening all over the country. So will he run? My initial instinct on this is no, he won't.
And if he runs, I just need a yes or no question. If he runs, yes or no, does he get the nomination?
No.
Thank you very much.